Hi, my name's Kay Harth and I represent Queensland Council Parents and Citizens Associations on ACSO. I'd like to introduce you in this last session to two ladies who I think if you've been watching them today, you would have no doubt about their enthusiasm and commitment to the role they have in engaging parents and families. If only we could bottle that, ladies. It's been brilliant watching you. They will take us on a journey in this session from their experiences both in Australia and internationally, and then into a conversation around what we've been exploring today. Firstly, Danielle Cronin, who we heard this morning is very much into being engaged in parenting with her next child on the way. And then Sharon Butler, who turns, I hear, her hand to a bit of boxing to balance out her love of cooking. So, ladies and gentlemen, Danielle and then Sharon.
Well, hello again to those of us who are still here. I think the audience has diminished slightly in number, but that's okay. In this session, Sharon and I have been tasked with regaling you, I suppose, with our expertise as Churchill Fellows. But I have to say that I feel entirely sort of inadequate in that task. And I really don't know what else I could add, except to say that I think all of the wisdom that we need to progress this agenda effectively is in this room. So I'm going to sort of probably shuffle my presentation just a little bit to encourage hearing your voice in this conversation, but particularly around the two areas that Sharon and I are passionate about. So as Churchill Fellows, I think we sort of came at this question of parent and community engagement from two slightly different angles, if you like. So I'm a bit of a sort of a policy junkie, if you like. I try to make it sound sort of glamorous, and it's probably not. But public policy is kind of my thing. So I looked at parent and community engagement and family school partnerships through the lens of public policy. Sharon is very much at the practitioner level. What does good practice look like? So that's kind of how our studies, I think, emerged. Rather than going through all of the outcomes of those particular studies, what I thought I would do is just signpost for you, I suppose, where you can actually download those reports. And I commend both of them to you. They both required a lot of work and a lot of travel around the world to achieve, but they are still really relevant documents for you to have a look at, so I encourage you to do so. Today, for me, I've chosen to talk to you this afternoon about, and briefly by the way, about public policy or policy as a tool in this domain. There are a number of reasons for that. I think that we've got a really interesting group of people gathered here this weekend, of policy makers, policy advocates, policy implementers, and a whole heap of sort of disruptive, innovators, I suppose, that I think that we can really move this agenda forward. The second key reason I want to focus on policy is that I think in Australia at the moment, and I think we've probably been in this space for a little while now, but we're actually sort of, I suppose, experiencing a bit of a policy window, if you like. So if you're a policy, buff and you read John Kingdon, it's where we've got the stars have aligned, if for lack of a better word, where the politics is ripe, the policy solutions are kind of there, and the advocates of all of this are just chomping at the bit to see change. So in a sense, if the stars are aligning for a good, solid direction to be set in a policy sense, now is it. In order to do that, though, I think that we need to more closely, more fully sort of bring together that coalition of the willing and the able, and I think that's you, to come up with an agreed sort of consensus about what the way forward looks like. And a core element of that way forward is policy, but policy is by no means the only element that's important in this work. So, with that in mind, policy, I think, is important because it does bring to, if I'm going to be an advocate for the policy end of this, is that policy does bring to the fore some of those key educational levers that can make a difference. And what we now know is that family school partnerships and parent engagement is a core and fundamental lever for affecting the outcomes of all kids. Policy also can provide the opportunity for us to have a debate and a dialogue about what works, when and how. Having said that, though, I think there needs to be an appropriate balance in policy around fostering, innovation, disruptive innovation, flexibility, local responses. But also this other question around accountability, the carrot, if you like. So and what we might consider to be things we might want to mandate, if anything at all. So I think this is an important conversation to have this afternoon. In order to spark a bit of a conversation about this, I want to first have a look at some of the outcomes very briefly of a conference that I attended last year, but also to have a look or pose to you 3 different styles of policy response that we can see currently sort of around the world. And have a bit of discussion about, well, are these the sorts of directions that we want to go down? Which ones sort of work for us? How far are we already down some of these tracks? So I'm going to begin with a bit of an overview of a conference that I attended in Italy last year. It was the EURNAPE conference, the European Research Network about Parents in Education. Very European-focused and North American-focused researchers attend this conference. These are kind of the research strands that were being explored throughout the conference. So I know there are a number of you in the audience who are currently doing PhDs in this area or are looking to do some postgrad research. These are some of the key sort of themes that are emerging, particularly in Europe at the moment. I'm not going to focus so much on the research themes as the ideas that kind of cut across all of these research streams. So what were the 3 key messages that I was getting from listening to these researchers? The first was that, and I think this is affirming what we already know very clearly, that learning needs to be at the centre of this work. And that as Mary was saying, that if this is about learning and it's about pedagogy, what does a pedagogy of engagement, if you like, look like? So in Australia, we've begun down this journey with looking at, standards for pre-service teacher education, teacher standards, principal standards that have elements of how they should involve parents and communities. But quite often it's limited to enhancing their understanding of the role of parents or understanding that we need to look beyond the school gate. It's not necessarily addressing the pedagogical issues that come with that greater understanding. The other key message I think coming out of this was that, well, if this is one of the part of the pedagogical task of schools, well, then that task also has to be supported by those in the community more broadly. And in that sense, what they were talking about was a need for there to be a complementarity or complementary learning environments. This is very much the Harvard model, that children do learn everywhere. How do we ensure that there's a sense of a common purpose around learning in all of those spaces? So how do we make those structures more permeable? How do we generate a consensus around the core purpose of learning? And this is kids' outcomes, their well-being, and development, and those sorts of things. Have I gone too far? Oh, right. And then the second key message, and again, this is a reaffirming what we've already been talking about today, is that families need opportunities to be both involved and engaged. And that very much this is about a possibility, if you like, an invitation for all families, not just those families who are easy to reach, not just those families that we wish we had in our schools, but all families. And that what we know is that the ability and the willingness and the need to engage all families cuts across socioeconomic boundaries and it cuts across cultural boundaries. And we know that sometimes these are actually used as excuses for not being able to engage certain groups or that we sort of take a deficit approach. And this is something that we have to, as advocates, as you and I, need to challenge this all the time. The third key theme was around the disempowerment and the empowerment or relative empowerment of teachers and parents in a policy sense. And that quite often, internationally, and to some degree here in Australia, we talk about parents and parenting community engagement and homeschool partnerships as a way to address disadvantage, as a way to fix something that we think is broken or somehow deficient. And that's not the case. This is about thinking about family-school partnerships and parenting community engagement as a universal thing. It's for all schools, all families. Because there are families, even in our probably our better sort of higher risk SES communities, that also need support to engage more effectively with their communities. Or, so it's not as simple as just targeting it to certain groups, particularly when that leads to some pretty deficit thinking about needing to fix a particular subset of our population. So it's challenging that thinking, and certainly the call at this conference from all the practitioners and the researchers was for a different mindset around strengths and capacities, so that community development mindset, around universal support and prevention, around empowering local responses, because the experts are at the coalface. The experts are the teachers and the families and those who work with families on a daily basis. That there needs to be flexibility for school communities to manoeuvre through this policy framework to meet the needs of their individual school communities. But that targeted support is still critically important. So instead what they're kind of calling for is an environment-orientated policy that is robust enough to provide clear direction, but flexible enough for local response. So there'll be some things under a policy framework like this that all schools offer to all families, so that universal sort of provision and support. But there will be times when schools need to offer very targeted, specialised support, and a model should be flexible enough and resourced appropriately to achieve those sorts of things. So they're just three of the ideas that really, really resonated with me out of this conference. So I'm going to park those there for the moment. And now I want to look at, well, if we're going to move forward in a policy sense or in a legislative sense, what are three models of moving forward? Now, I'm going to sort of talk about three. I've provided examples of the type of model under each of them, but there are numerous examples that you could fit under this particular heading of an embedded model. In fact, in Australia at the moment, we embed some of our parent and community stuff in our funding agreements. So in the schools, in the NEA and the Schools Assistance Act around reporting to parents and those sorts of provisions, right? So we were embedding that parent stuff within a piece of legislation. That's one model. This is in this particular instance, it's the No Child Left Behind Act. So it's an American model. These are all federal approaches, where a set of fairly prescriptive measures are embedded in the school's legislation. So embedded alongside all of the other things that schools need to achieve and do to get their money from the federal government. Right? In this particular case, the family and parent provisions are targeted at disadvantaged communities. It's very strong in accountability and reporting. It's a fairly punitive approach, and it's a highly politicised approach. So if the legislation that we're going to embed our parent and community work in is a highly controversial piece of legislation, we potentially make it highly vulnerable. Right? And already some of these things with the change of government have already been sort of abolished. So the perks, for example, have lost their funding because of a change in government. So it's a very political approach. And in this case, it was also very much about, in terms of the philosophy underlying it, around parental choice. And not necessarily parental choice because parents have a fundamental right to choose the most appropriate education for their children, but parental choice as a way to discipline the school market. Two very different things. The second potential policy scenario could be, a system-wide approach. So, for example, Ontario would be a classic example of this type of policy. Scotland is another, where it's a school system-wide approach to enhancing the profile of parent and community engagement through a number of provisions. Some of it is going to be through legislation and others through a suite of other policy and guidance documents, an Office of Parent and Community Engagement within the Department of Education, for example, so personnel support, tend to have sort of bipartisan support. and then try to address different aspects of the role of parents that they might play in the education of their children. And in this model, there tends to be a greater, certainly the ones that I've looked at, a greater potential for schools to respond in ways that are meaningful for them. So it's more devolved to the local level in terms of implementation. That's policy option number 2. Another option is a framework approach. So rather than it being a system level, so a school system level response, this is a whole of government interagency response to this particular question. Now, because families and children learn everywhere, this sort of response says, well, this needs a suite of legislation. This needs interagency collaboration to support students and children wherever they are, to support families wherever they are. So if the goal is successful outcomes for all children, irrespective of where they live, and strong and vibrant and supported families, then we need to have a holistic approach. So this is the approach that the UK government took under the Children's Plan. There was a range of legislation that covered education, justice, early childhood, health. All of them, though, all of these agencies and all these pieces of legislation worked to a common definition. They also worked to a common set of understandings and outcomes and goals. So they were all of these agencies, including schools, were working towards a common aim, but just coming at it from their particular area of expertise. This model really embraces the wraparound model and that notion of both universal and targeted support around permeable boundaries between schools and communities and schools and agencies and schools and families. Unfortunately, and this is also very much about a devolved model, so that schools were the best places to know what sort of supports they needed. So this particular framework allowed schools to choose from a menu of options to implement in their school, so to extend their services to assist families. Highly vulnerable to the political cycle as well, because of course change of government, Labor's out, the Conservatives are in, the Children's Plan disappears overnight. So some of the messages certainly that gone too far again, that I was getting is that we need to move beyond politics, we need to move beyond the policy cycle, and we also need to move somewhat beyond policy if we're going to respond effectively to this. The other key messages are that we need to inject resources, both human, financial, capital, into this work. We need to develop a coalition of advocates who want to create a demand for this sort of work in policy, to create a bipartisan approach to this sort of work. This is about what we do in this country. It's not a project, it is intrinsic to the educational project. So they're just some of the insights, I suppose, that policymakers in both the UK and North America were sort of sharing with me as I travelled around. So, if we're going to move this work from the periphery to the core, what does policy and the framework in which our policy sits, does it need to look like? Predominantly, for the sake of this conversation, perhaps at the federal level. So, what I'm going to do, I'm feeling a bit brave. If the first, first 3 rows discuss question number 1, the next 3 rows discuss question number 2, and the remainder discuss question number 3 for about 5 minutes. And I want you to be brave and quite strong in your opinions, because I think this is the opportunity for us to tell policymakers what we think should be on the table, off the table, what's needed, and how do we get the balance right that meets the needs of practitioners. So turn to more than perhaps 2 of you, so probably in small groups. So the first group is going to talk about, well, is there a positive role for legislation? Can we legislate for this? How might we do it? What are the limitations of legislation? The second group I would like you to discuss, well, what's the appropriate balance if we're going to legislate and have policies between generating the necessary cultural change that we need, that disruptive innovation that Mary and John were talking about, localised responses, but also this notion of accountability and, and compliance. Then the third group to talk about, well, how do we get the balance right between that universal, wraparound, holistic approach that might be needed, as well as looking at sort of more targeted programmatic responses that might also be needed to meet particular groups within our communities. All right, so we might actually sort of feed back now, and if there are any brave souls who in this sort of this front group who would like to share a particular insight or a challenge to the government. I'm sure Anne Bliss will. Would you like to share some of the insights from your group?
We talked about the pros and cons of legislation. We talked about the pros and cons of legislation to drive change, and we talked about the potential difficulties that legislation may be seen as an authoritarian and an adversarial way of approaching it, and therefore it could create here's another thing we have to do as a ticker box approach to things. And we use the analogy of the 2 face-to-face parent meetings a year and a A to E report card, and how that was addressed as a ticker box as opposed to a really authentic approach to parental engagement. We talked about some industrial barriers to embedding issues like this in legislation and how that may be seen by educators, school leaders and so on. But then we also looked at it from a positive point of view, that legislation could be the trigger for embedding in practice, and that some people would see it as a validation of what they see as important in their work, and therefore it creates really great opportunities for models to thrive and therefore become embedded in culture. Yeah. We had both sides.
That's great. What about the second group? Is there a brave soul? Come on, Ash will probably share some insights. or Paul Rodney, or Peter Levitt.
We were discussing about cultural change and localised responses, and we said that unless you do the groundwork, then you really need localised policy initially, because if you impose something from the top, then it often alienates instead of engages.
Yeah. And the final group, trying my eyesight, Tim Smith, Ian Palmer, John, and Catherine Eibel. It's great being in an audience where you can name everybody on your first name basis.
Thank you. I think the question 2B was very difficult, and we need about another 5 months to digest the question and research it. And, a few overseas trips would go in nicely to explore that. But we were having a debate again around the benefits of legislation and policy, and that in itself is a balancing act, and then programmatic and targeted approaches, all of that. You just spun us in circles there, I'm sorry. Yeah. Big one.
Raise of hands, who prefers a model where we kind of do what we kind of do, but it's embedded in the schools legislation and keep chugging along?
The schools legislation or the government, sorry, what do you mean?
Oh, schools legislation, so the NEA or the Schools Assistance Act, or you build it into the regulations around schools. A sort of a system-wide, a la Ontario, Scotland model. So it's still heavily schools focused. Sort of the children's plan framework, holistic model. All right, there's a few of us. All right, so I'm going to hand over to Sharon now to provoke us even more.
Thanks, Danielle. Thank you. Yes, that's how I feel. I'm not 100% sure about provoking you right now. I know that I'm the only thing standing between you and a drink, and it's putting me... I'm not feeling good standing here. All right. All I can think is that Danielle and I are not terribly compliant human beings because we were asked to talk about our Churchill projects and neither of us were not going to. So I'm not going to either. Sorry? Yeah, read it. We recommended it. Instead, what I want to do is, and I want to just share some stray thoughts, and they seriously are very stray thoughts. I've just 3 weeks ago come back from the 16th International Roundtable on Family School Community Partnerships, which Joyce Epstein hosts in Vancouver, and also the American Educational Research Association conference. And so what I wanted to do was perhaps just share some of the things that I took from the two conferences. Now, I have to explain why I don't have a coherent, marvellously thought through, pristine presentation for you. And that is because over the course of 4 days, I listened to 95 speakers. And my head is still rotating a little bit. It's all in my iPad, and all I have to do is kind of sift through it. So what I thought I'd do instead is just rely on kind of my memory and going back through my notes and thinking what were the things that actually resonated for me in some shape or form and hit some bells. So I'm not going to give you definitive pieces of work. I'm going to give you some stray thoughts and some things that I thought were kind of interesting as I went along. At the 16th International Roundtable, the keynote, they always start with a sort of plenary session. And the first one was on fathers' engagement in education. I thought that was interesting. And in fact, there's a new book coming out soon, and I'll give you the reference for that. Cross-cultural research that had been done looking at how fathers engage in education. And I just want to briefly touch on some of the things that has come out from the initial research. So in Turkey, there was actually a piece of research that was done that was a cross-cultural comparison between father engagement in Turkey and father engagement in the USA in terms of their engagement in kids' learning. Interestingly, the dads they chose to study in the USA were incarcerated dads, and I'm not quite sure why that's so, whether they were in fact the only group they could get to respond, or it was a curious choice. It's in the legislation, that's right. But what they actually found is that there's actually quite extensive father engagement in education that occurs in Turkey, and it occurs in the coffee houses in Turkey. So again, I think that reinforces some of the messages we've had today about place-based responses, about learning happening everywhere, and considering learning beyond the school gates. The other things some of the things, and I'll just talk a little bit about each thing that struck me, is that fathers preferred short, face-to-face communication. In the US, they preferred it by email. In Turkey, they preferred it by phone, but they wanted it short, sharp and targeted. Communication with schools was largely commenced by fathers. They took the initiative, and there was certainly a readiness of fathers to be involved that was identified, and that surprised the researchers. So they're actually looking at being able to create new zones for dads' involvement. In South Korea and Taiwan, providing financial capital is seen to be a real burden to father involvement. They work really long hours to provide for their kids, and there's also a significant, increasingly documented confusion regarding their roles. They're being told they shouldn't be authoritarian, but they don't want to be friends, and dads are kind of struggling largely to identify what their role construction should be. So if we look at that in the face of Jean's research around parental role construction, I think that's an interesting thing to potentially explore. They had feelings of alienation from kids across all age ranges. They want to get close, but their perceived realities get in the way. The researchers looked at 4 dyads. They looked at mums and sons, mothers and daughters, fathers and sons, and fathers and daughters to see if there were any differences in terms of engagement. They looked at involvement in school and at home, educational aspiration and academic achievement across those 4 dyads. They found that father involvement did not have a direct effect on academic achievement, but it did have an indirect effect through the mediating variable of aspiration, especially in same-sex dyads. So dads to dads, mothers to mothers. But mothers' involvement was found to have a direct effect on academic achievement. They talked about, and I think this is a really interesting one, I think maybe our brokerage partners could explore this one. They gave the example, there's a tech company, a high-tech company in Taiwan called, and I'll get this right, it's called Hermes Epitech. And they actually have enabled time for the employers have actually set up parenting groups within company time. And so they sponsor time for families to get together to talk about parenting. throughout time, and to have time off and to learn parenting skills. So I often thought you could talk about schools providing parenting skills, and we know that a lot of research will tell us that families actually don't want to learn from teachers, and so I think there's an interesting area to explore about industry potentially providing that space. Taiwan also has a Gender Equity and Curriculum Act. Maybe you guys knew this, but I didn't, and I found it absolutely fascinating. So they have the Gender Equity in Curriculum Act. They've established parental involvement in school in their legislation, and the researchers showed us a great page from a grade 5 social science book that showed mum going off to work with her promotion and dad staying home, and literally it has to get spattered throughout the curriculum. So they're really looking at trying to mix up, I think, how parental roles are defined as well. In Quebec, they found they've got a higher involvement of fathers in the last 10 years in socialising activities, especially during things like playtime, bedtime and sport. Fathers give greater autonomy granting, and especially in non-traditional families. They have less involvement in schooling except, and I thought this was interesting too, except in year 10 for boys, when they're more likely to discuss current events and engage in conversation with their sons. They found father support for achievement was twice more important for girls and 3 times more important for boys. There were more authoritarian styles of homework supervision and more positive perceptions of the usefulness of homework from dads. In Africa, African dads are willing to sacrifice time and family valuables to enable schooling so that their kids get a better life. About 25% of earnings go to education. Fathers are responsible for passing on the knowledge of traditions, cultures and trades. Mothers, the more oral traditions of stories, music and dance. Very strong clan ties, so if a father dies, then another male in the family is expected to come in and pick up the educational support. Children are ranked to determine scholarships, so only some kids get scholarships, so a very, very, very high focus on outcomes. And again, I found that interesting given the number of African families that we certainly have moving into Victoria, so with regard to understanding some of the parental aspiration there. And that's just a taste, because in this conference, you know, everyone just gets about 10 minutes to talk about their research and then it's on to the next person. But this is the book that's going to be